She reached across the polished mahogany table and grabbed his hand with a grip that could crush diamonds. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into his dark skin as photographers' cameras flashed around them like lightning in a storm. She smiled that $1,000,000 smile, the one that had landed her on the cover of Forbes 3 times, and leaned into him as if he were the love of her life. He sat there, frozen, his expression unreadable behind those designer glasses. What she didn't know in that moment, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the man whose hand she was clutching so desperately was about to become her worst nightmare. Because while she was busy playing pretend for the cameras, he was already 10 steps ahead, holding cards she didn't even know were in the deck. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a moment and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Are you in New York City, watching this during your lunch break? Maybe you're in London, catching this before bed. Or perhaps you're somewhere in Texas, sipping your morning coffee. Let us know your city because this situation could happen anywhere, to anyone, and you need to hear how this played out. This isn't just a story about business or romance or betrayal. It's about power, about who really controls the narrative, and about what happens when someone you think you're using turns out to be using you in ways you never imagined possible. Her name was Victoria Ashford, and at 38 years old, she had built an empire that most people only dreamed about. Ashford Enterprises wasn't just a company, it was a dynasty worth $3.7 billion. She had clawed her way up from a modest background, graduated top of her class from Wharton, and spent 15 years building her tech and real estate conglomerate into something that made competitors tremble. Victoria had everything. The penthouse in Manhattan overlooking Central Park with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look like it belonged to her, the villa in the Hamptons with 12 bedrooms and a private beach, the yacht docked in Miami that she used maybe twice a year, but kept because it was expected of someone at her level, and a reputation as one of the most ruthless CEOs in America. She was known for hostile takeovers that left entire companies gutted, for crushing smaller businesses that stood in her way, for making grown men with decades of experience cry in boardrooms when she systematically dismantled their arguments and their careers simultaneously. Victoria didn't just play the game. She rewrote the rules, then won anyway. She had pioneered acquisition strategies that business schools now studied. She had turned struggling properties into billion-dollar developments. She had identified tech startups before anyone else saw their potential, bought them for pennies, and turned them into profit machines. Her instincts were legendary. Her work ethic was inhuman. She slept 4 hours a night, was in the office by 5:30 every morning, and had been known to send emails at 3 in the morning expecting responses by dawn. She didn't take vacations, didn't have hobbies, didn't have friends in any real sense of the word. She had associates, contacts, people who were useful to her empire. Everything and everyone in Victoria's life served a purpose, had a function, contributed to the machine she'd built. But Victoria had one problem that money couldn't solve, and it was threatening to bring down everything she'd constructed. Her public image was taking hits, hard ones that were starting to impact her bottom line. 3 separate lawsuits from former employees, all claiming discrimination based on race and gender. Social media was calling her out relentlessly. Hashtags were trending multiple times a week, and her board of directors was getting increasingly nervous about the negative attention. Investors were pulling back, questioning whether being associated with her brand was worth the reputational risk. Her company's stock had dropped 11% in just 2 months, wiping out nearly $400 million in market value. The public relations team had been in crisis mode for weeks, throwing out idea after idea to rehabilitate her image, but nothing was working. Nothing was sticking. Focus groups said she came across as cold, calculating, elitist, completely out of touch with regular people. They used words like ice queen and corporate villain and heartless. One PR consultant had even used the word villainous in a meeting, which had made Victoria so angry she'd thrown a crystal paperweight across her office, shattering it against the wall. Her assistant had quietly cleaned up the glass while Victoria stood at her window, seething, watching the city below and feeling control slipping away for the first time in her career. The media was painting her as everything wrong with corporate America, greedy, uncaring, willing to destroy lives for profit. And the worst part, the part that made Victoria's blood boil, was that she couldn't just buy her way out of this one. She'd tried. She donated to charities, sponsored community programs, issued carefully worded statements through her PR team. Nothing worked. The narrative had solidified, and she was the villain. That's when her chief marketing officer, a nervous man named Gerald, who was always sweating through his expensive shirts, no matter how cold the office was, came up with the plan that would change everything. They needed to humanize her, he'd said, wringing his hands in that way that made Victoria want to fire him on the spot. They needed to make her relatable, show a softer side, prove she was more than just a corporate shark in designer suits. What better way than to have her seen with a romantic partner? Someone who could make her appear warm and caring and capable of human emotion. But not just anyone. They needed someone who would flip the narrative completely, someone whose presence alone would contradict every accusation being thrown at her. Gerald had suggested they find someone for a staged relationship just for a few months, just until the heat died down and the news cycle moved on to some other scandal. Victoria had laughed at first, a sharp, bitter sound that made Gerald flinch. The idea was absurd, insulting even. She didn't need a man to fix her problems. She had built her empire alone, without depending on anyone, without needing validation or support or partnership. She could handle a few bad headlines and some angry posts on social media. She'd faced worse obstacles on her way to the top. She'd survived being underestimated, dismissed, excluded from rooms where decisions were made. She'd fought her way into boardrooms where she was the only woman, where men twice her age looked at her like she didn't belong. She'd proven them all wrong, one acquisition at a time, one successful quarter after another. She didn't need anyone, especially not some paid actor pretending to care about her for the cameras. But then her lead investor, Marcus Wellington, called her personally. Not an email, not a message through assistants, but an actual phone call on her private line, which meant it was serious. He was pulling $40 million unless she turned things around within 60 days. $40 million. He'd been with her since the early days, had believed in her when others wouldn't, and now even he was backing away. He was concerned about optics, he'd said, about long-term viability, about whether the company could survive with this much negative attention. Other investors were asking questions. The board was pressuring him. He didn't have a choice. That was when Victoria stopped laughing and started listening. That was when she realized this wasn't just about headlines or hashtags or her ego. This was about survival. This was about everything she'd built crumbling because she couldn't control a narrative. The plan was simple on paper, deceptively so. Find someone presentable, someone who could play the part convincingly, stage a few public appearances at high-profile events, feed carefully crafted stories to friendly media outlets, and ride out the storm until people found something else to be outraged about. Gerald had already compiled a list of potential candidates, mostly actors or models who would do it for the right price and had experience looking natural in front of cameras. But Victoria had vetoed all of them after spending maybe 30 seconds reviewing each profile. They were too obvious, she'd said, tossing the folder back across her desk. Too polished, too perfect, too clearly fake. People weren't stupid. They could smell a publicity stunt from a mile away. She needed someone real, someone whose presence would generate genuine surprise and interest, someone who would make people actually believe she'd changed. That's when she saw him at that charity gala in downtown Manhattan, one of those expensive events where people paid $50,000 a table to feel good about themselves while eating food they could barely pronounce. Marcus Thompson. He was standing near the bar, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but somehow didn't look like he was trying too hard. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with rich dark skin that seemed to catch the light, and an athletic build that the suit showed off without making it obvious. He wore simple gold-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual air, and he was listening intently to an older woman talking animatedly about something, nodding thoughtfully, genuinely engaged in whatever she was saying rather than scanning the room for more important people to network with like everyone else was doing. There was something about the way he carried himself that caught Victoria's attention and held it. He was confident, but not arrogant, present but not attention-seeking, comfortable in his own skin in a way that seemed almost foreign to Victoria in this world of constant performance and positioning. He laughed at something the older woman said, a genuine laugh that reached his eyes, and Victoria found herself watching him in a way she hadn't watched anyone in years. Not as a potential asset or a business opportunity, but as a person who intrigued her. Then she caught herself, pushed that thought away, and shifted into business mode. This wasn't about intrigue or genuine interest. This was about finding the right tool for the job, and something told her he was exactly what she needed. Victoria did what Victoria always did when she identified something she wanted. She researched, and she researched thoroughly. Within 20 minutes, her assistant had pulled up everything available on Marcus Thompson, and Victoria reviewed it all with the focused intensity she brought to analyzing acquisition targets. 35 years old, grew up in Baltimore in a middle-class neighborhood, scholarship to MIT, where he studied engineering and business and graduated with honors, worked in tech for several years at companies that were impressive, but not headline, making before pivoting to venture capital. Currently worked as a senior analyst at some mid-tier investment firm called Quantum Dynamics that Victoria had never heard of, which meant it wasn't important enough to be on her radar. Single, no scandals, no controversies, no embarrassing social media history that could be weaponized. He kept a low profile despite running in some impressive circles and making appearances at events that suggested he had access to money and power even if he wasn't splashing it around. He had money but not headline making money. He was successful but not famous. He was connected but not central to any particular power structure. He was exactly what she needed: presentable, accomplished, attractive, and most importantly, someone whose presence by her side would completely rewrite the narrative people had built around her. A black man in tech and finance who was clearly successful in his own right, not someone who needed her money or her connections. Someone whose presence would make all those discrimination accusations look ridiculous. Someone who would make her seem softer, warmer, more human. He was perfect, and Victoria always got what she wanted when she identified something perfect for her purposes. She approached him that night with her game face on, the one she used when acquiring companies or negotiating deals worth hundreds of millions. She introduced herself, which was unnecessary because everyone in the room knew who Victoria Ashford was, but she did it anyway with a warm smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned on the charm, asked him thoughtful questions about his work, mentioned connections they had in common, and within 15 minutes had suggested they grab coffee sometime to discuss potential business opportunities. It was a line she'd used 1,000 times, a way of creating obligation and interest without committing to anything specific. Marcus had agreed politely, giving her his business card with information that matched what her assistant had already pulled up. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at her, a flicker of something she couldn't quite read. Amusement maybe, or was it recognition? Was it interest or calculation? She couldn't tell, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. They met 3 days later at a private dining room in an upscale restaurant where entries started at $200 and reservations were booked months in advance, unless you were someone like Victoria who could get a table with a single phone call. The space was intimate, all dark wood and soft lighting, designed for confidential conversations between people who had things to hide or plans to make. Victoria didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She laid out her proposal like she was presenting a merger deal, direct and businesslike, numbers and terms and expectations. She needed someone to pose as her boyfriend for 3 months, maybe 4 at most. Public appearances at specific events that her team would schedule and coordinate, some carefully staged paparazzi photos at restaurants and art galleries, a few strategic social media posts that would seem spontaneous but would actually be meticulously planned. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that would cross professional boundaries or require actual intimacy. Just enough public interaction to change the narrative, to make her seem human and capable of connection. In exchange, she would pay him $250,000, which was more than generous for what amounted to part-time work, and make introductions that could accelerate his career by a decade, opening doors that would otherwise take him years to access. Marcus had listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, his hands folded calmly on the table in front of him like he was hearing a business pitch that he might or might not be interested in. His body language gave away nothing. When she finished her presentation, laying out the terms and timeline and compensation with the same precision she used in board meetings, he was quiet for what felt like an eternity. Victoria wasn't used to silence in negotiations. Usually people jumped at opportunities she presented, eager to say yes before she changed her mind. But Marcus just sat there, his eyes on her face, reading her in ways that made her uncomfortable. Then he spoke, and his voice was deeper than she remembered from the gala, steady and measured and completely in control. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with a casualness that somehow felt calculated. "You want me to pretend to be in love with you, because your company is hemorrhaging value due to your reputation as someone who discriminates against people who look like me. And you think parading me around like a prop is going to fix that. You think that's somehow not going to be incredibly transparent and possibly even more offensive than what you're already being accused of. Victoria's jaw tightened, and she felt anger flash hot through her chest. Nobody spoke to her like that. Nobody questioned her strategies or implied she was being offensive or stupid. She was Victoria Ashford. She'd built a billion-dollar empire. She knew what she was doing. I wouldn't phrase it quite so crudely, she said, her voice ice cold. But yes, essentially, this is a business transaction that benefits both of us. You get money and connections. I get a temporary image rehabilitation. It's simple, it's effective, and it's mutually beneficial. Both of us. Marcus repeated, and now there was definitely amusement in his voice, a slight smile playing at his lips like he was enjoying a private joke. Tell me, Victoria, what made you think I would be interested in being bought? What made you think that offering me money would be enough to get me to participate in something this insulting? Everyone has a price, she said coldly, falling back on a principle that had never failed her. I'm offering you a very generous one, more generous than you'll get anywhere else for this kind of arrangement. Are you? He leaned forward now, and something in his demeanor shifted completely. The polite, reserved man from the gala was gone, replaced by someone sharper, more intense, someone who suddenly seemed to take up more space in the room than he had a moment ago. Let's talk about prices and what things are really worth. Victoria, your company's stock is at $73 per share, down from $82 just last month. That's an 11% drop in 30 days, which is catastrophic by any measure. Your Q3 earnings report is coming up in 6 weeks, and analysts are predicting you'll miss projections by at least 15%, possibly more. You've got 3 major deals in negotiation right now, one with TechBridge Solutions worth about $200 million, one with Meridian Real Estate Group worth $350 million, and one with Quantum Dynamics worth $500 million. All 3 are stalling, not because of terms or numbers, but because the CEOs don't want the bad publicity of being associated with you right now. Your board is getting antsy, especially Patricia Chen and Robert Morrison, who've been quietly meeting with other board members about potentially calling for a vote of no confidence. They haven't made a move yet, but they're building support, testing the waters. Should I continue? Victoria felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Everything he just said was accurate, down to the specific names and numbers and dollar amounts. Information that should have been confidential, known only to her inner circle, discussed only in private meetings and encrypted emails. Some of it she'd only learned herself in the past week. How do you know all that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I do my homework, Marcus said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Just like you did on me. You had your assistant pull up everything you could find within 20 minutes of seeing me at that gala. Credit report, employment history, educational background, relationship status, social media activity. You probably know what I had for breakfast last Tuesday. The difference is, I did mine better. I did mine deeper. I did mine months ago. What do you want? Victoria asked, her voice hard as steel now, all pretense of politeness gone. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was something else entirely. I'll do it, Marcus said, his tone shifting to match hers. All business now. I'll play your boyfriend, show up to your events, smile for your cameras, play whatever role you need me to play, but not for money. Money doesn't interest me. I have enough money. Then for what? For equity. Victoria actually laughed, a sharp sound that echoed in the small private room. Equity. In Ashford Enterprises, you're out of your mind. I don't give away pieces of my company. Not to investors, not to partners, certainly not to someone I'm hiring for a temporary performance. That's not how this works. Not your company, Marcus said calmly, and his eyes were locked on hers now, intense and unwavering. Your autonomy. I want decision-making power. I want a seat at the table where real choices get made. I'll take 5% equity and a position on your board of directors. That's my price. Absolutely not, Victoria snapped, standing up from her chair so fast it almost tipped over. I built this company from nothing. From nothing. I started with a business degree, and $20,000 I scraped together. I'm not handing over control to some analyst I met at a charity event who thinks he can waltz in and make demands. Then good luck with your rehabilitation tour, Marcus said, standing up himself, his movements casual and unhurried. I'm sure you'll find someone else willing to be your token black boyfriend for $250,000. though I doubt they'll be as effective as I would be. And I doubt they'll be believable enough to actually move the needle on your stock price or convince your board that you've changed. But hey, it's your company, your reputation, your choice. He started to walk toward the door, and Victoria felt panic rising in her chest, hot and suffocating. She needed him. Not just anyone who fit the demographic profile, but specifically him. He was perfect for this in ways she couldn't fully articulate. He had the background, the presence, the intelligence to be believable. And worse, he knew it. He knew exactly how much she needed him, and he was using that knowledge against her. Wait, she called out, the word catching in her throat because she wasn't used to being the one who called people back. 1%. And an advisory role, not a board seat. That's my counteroffer. Marcus turned around slowly, that slight smile back on his face. 3%. Board seat. None voting for the first year so you can maintain control. Voting after that so I actually have influence. And I want it in writing before we make our first public appearance. I want contracts signed by lawyers, filed properly. Everything documented so you can't back out once you get what you need from this arrangement. Victoria wanted to throw something at him. She wanted to tell him to walk out and never come back. She wanted to call security and have him escorted from the building. But she thought about $40 million being pulled. She thought about the stock price dropping another 11%. She thought about Patricia Chen and Robert Morrison gathering votes for a no-confidence motion. She thought about the empire she'd spent 15 years building, brick by brick, deal by deal, starting to crack at the foundation. 2%, she said through gritted teeth. Board seat. None voting for 2 years, not one. Take it or leave it. That's my final offer. Marcus walked back to the table with that same unhurried pace, pulled out his chair, and sat down like he had all the time in the world. Deal. I'll have my lawyer draw up the contracts. You're welcome to have your legal team review them before signing. I want this to be completely legitimate and above board. And that's how Victoria Ashford, who had never given away a single percentage point of her company in 15 years, who had maintained absolute control through hundreds of negotiations and acquisitions, found herself agreeing to give equity and board access to a man she'd known for less than a week. She told herself it was strategic, temporary, manageable. She told herself 2% was nothing, that non-voting meant powerless, that she'd find a way to buy him out once this crisis passed. She told herself she was still in control. She had no idea how wrong she was. The first public appearance was at a tech industry gala 2 weeks later, giving them time to get contracts signed and to prepare for what Victoria's team kept calling the launch of the relationship narrative. Victoria's PR team had orchestrated everything perfectly, down to the minute. They arrived separately to avoid looking too rehearsed, spent exactly 47 minutes inside at different locations in the venue, then left together, Marcus's hand on the small of her back as they exited to a waiting car. The physical contact had been discussed and agreed upon. The gesture was intimate but respectful, possessive but not overtly sexual. Photographers got exactly the shots they needed because Victoria's team had made sure the right photographers were in the right positions. Social media exploded within hours, exactly as planned. Who was the mystery man with Victoria Ashford? The Ice Queen has a boyfriend. The hashtag started trending immediately. By morning, entertainment and business news outlets had identified him, had pulled the same basic information Victoria's assistant had found, and the narrative Victoria's team had crafted was taking hold exactly as designed. She was in a relationship. She seemed happy, genuinely happy in the photos. Maybe she wasn't the Ice Queen everyone thought she was. Maybe there was more to her than boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. The second appearance was at a charity auction benefiting arts education, and that's where things started to deviate from the script in ways that made Victoria's carefully constructed plan feel less solid. They were seated at a premium table with several other influential couples, the kind of people whose names appeared in business journals and whose donations funded political campaigns. Victoria was playing her part perfectly, touching Marcus's arm at appropriate moments, laughing at his comments with just the right amount of genuine, seeming affection, looking at him with manufactured adoration that she'd practiced in a mirror. The performance was flawless. Halfway through dinner, a business associate of Victoria's, an older white man named Charles Hoffman, who ran a retail chain and thought his money made him interesting, made a comment about urban crime rates while discussing his company's decision not to open locations in certain neighborhoods. He said it casually, like it was just obvious business sense, like everyone at the table would naturally agree with his assessment. The table got quiet in that uncomfortable way that happens when someone says something that might be offensive, but nobody wants to be the one to call it out. Victoria felt Marcus's entire body tense beside her, every muscle suddenly coiled. "That's an interesting perspective, Charles," Marcus said, his voice pleasant but with an edge underneath that made it clear this wasn't actually a compliment. "Tell me, have you actually looked at the data on crime rates, correlated with economic investment and opportunity? Or are you just repeating something you heard on cable news?" Charles's face reddened, and Victoria saw his hand tighten around his wine glass. "I'm just stating facts. Crime statistics are public record." "Facts," Marcus repeated, and now his voice had gone quieter, more dangerous. "Like the fact that your company received $23 million in tax breaks to open your headquarters in a gentrified neighborhood that displaced hundreds of families who'd lived there for generations. Or the fact that your hiring practices have resulted in 3 separate EEOC complaints in the last 4 years for racial discrimination. Those kinds of facts. Or do we only care about facts when they support the narrative we've already decided to believe?" The table was completely silent now. Nobody was eating. Nobody was even pretending to look at their phones. Everyone was staring at Marcus, at Charles, at the confrontation unfolding in real time. Victoria was staring at Marcus too, her mind racing, unsure whether to be horrified that he was making a scene or impressed that he was willing to say what everyone else was thinking, but was too polite or too scared to articulate. Charles looked like he wanted to crawl under the table or punch Marcus, possibly both. "I think we should change the subject," someone said nervously, a woman Victoria vaguely recognized from some committee or another. But Marcus wasn't done. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Charles with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably in his seat. "No, let's not change the subject. Let's talk about why men like Charles feel comfortable saying things like that at a table with me sitting right here. Let's talk about the casual racism that gets packaged as business sense. Let's talk about performative charity where people write big checks at events like this and feel good about themselves while simultaneously supporting policies and practices that perpetuate the exact problems they claim to want to solve. Let's talk about real systemic change versus just throwing money at problems so we can feel like we're helping. Unless everyone here just wants to keep playing this game where we pretend we're making a difference while nothing actually changes." Victoria grabbed his hand then, hard, squeezing it in what photographers later captured as a moment of intimate connection, of shared understanding between partners. But she was actually trying to shut him up, to stop him from completely derailing her carefully planned evening, from making enemies she might need down the line. Marcus looked at her, and something passed between them, a challenge in his eyes that asked what she was going to do, whose side she was going to take. She smiled for the cameras that she knew were watching, and leaned close to his ear. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed, her lips barely moving, maintaining the smile. "I'm being authentic," he whispered back, his own expression unchanging. "Isn't that what you wanted? Someone real? Someone who would make this believable. Nobody's going to buy that you've changed if I'm just another prop sitting quietly next to you." The photos from that night went viral in ways Victoria's team hadn't anticipated and couldn't have planned for. Not just the romantic shots of the intimate hand, holding and whispered conversations, but a video someone had taken on their phone of Marcus's confrontation with Charles. It spread across social media like wildfire, racking up millions of views within 24 hours. Social media exploded again, but this time the narrative was different from what Victoria's team had carefully constructed. People weren't just talking about Victoria having a boyfriend anymore. They were calling Marcus brave. They were praising him for speaking truth to power, for calling out racism in elite spaces, for not being afraid to make wealthy white people uncomfortable. And by extension, they were praising Victoria for being with someone who stood up for his values, who wasn't willing to play along with casual bigotry, even in high society settings. The hashtags that had been attacking her were now celebrating her choice of partner. Her PR team was ecstatic, calling it better than anything they could have planned, celebrating the authentic moment that was resonating with people in ways their staged photo ops never could. But Victoria was deeply unsettled. This wasn't going according to plan. Marcus was supposed to be playing a role, following her script, doing what she paid him to do. Instead, he was improvising, taking control of the narrative in ways she hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control. And worse, people were responding to it. They were responding to him, to his authenticity, to his willingness to challenge the status quo that Victoria herself represented. The optics were perfect, but she was losing control of the story, and that terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Over the next month, they appeared together at 6 more events, each one meticulously planned by Victoria's team, but each one featuring Marcus doing something unexpected that shifted the narrative in ways nobody had scripted. He called out a museum director at a fundraising gala for having no black artists represented in a prominent exhibition that claimed to celebrate American art. He challenged a tech CEO at a conference about diversity in leadership positions, pointing out that their executive team was entirely white despite the company claiming to value inclusion. He donated $100,000 of his own money to a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing STEM degrees. And when reporters asked about it, he said it was inspired by Victoria's commitment to giving back and creating opportunities, which was news to Victoria, who gave to charity solely for tax purposes and had never thought about education access in her entire life. Her company's stock price started climbing steadily, recovering the losses from the previous months, and then pushing higher. The lawsuits were settling quietly with NDAs and financial agreements that cost her money, but made the problems disappear from public view. Investors were coming back, calling to schedule meetings, expressing renewed interest in partnerships. The board was pleased with the turnaround, with Patricia Chen even commenting at a meeting that Victoria seemed more grounded lately, more thoughtful. Everything was working. The plan was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of her own plan, that Marcus was steering this ship more than she was, that people were starting to see him as the reason for her transformation, rather than her as the one changing. They were alone in her penthouse apartment one evening, having left a dinner event early because Victoria had claimed fatigue, but actually wanted to talk without an audience. They were supposed to be rehearsing for an upcoming interview they'd agreed to do together, a major network primetime special that would cement their relationship narrative and hopefully push her rehabilitation even further. But Victoria couldn't focus on the rehearsal questions. She was pacing her living room, her heels clicking on the marble floor, while Marcus stood at her floor, tip-ceiling windows looking out at the Manhattan skyline like he owned the view. "You're not sticking to the script," she said finally, stopping her pacing to face him. "We had an agreement. You show up, look good, say the right things. You're not supposed to be making waves. You're not supposed to be challenging people and making enemies." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, still looking out at the city lights. The script wasn't working, he said finally, turning to face her. "People can smell fake from a mile away. They've been watching you perform for years. They know what calculated looks like. What we're doing now is working because it's real, or at least real enough that people want to believe it. What we're doing now is you taking over my narrative." Victoria shot back, her frustration finally breaking through. "This was supposed to be about rehabilitating my image, fixing my reputation, saving my company, not building yours, not making you the star of this story." He turned to look at her fully now, and there was something in his expression that made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite name. "Victoria, do you know why this is working? Do you actually understand what's happening here? It's not because people believe you've changed. Nobody's that naive. It's because they believe I'm changing you. They see me challenging you, pushing you, standing up for things you've never cared about, and they're hoping some of it rubs off. They're hoping that maybe being with me will make you a better person, or at least a less terrible CEO. That's ridiculous," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Marcus walked away from the window, closer to where she stood, and she had to resist the urge to back away. "When was the last time you actually thought about the impact of your business decisions beyond the bottom line? When did you last consider whether buying out a competitor meant destroying hundreds of jobs, ruining families, crushing people's dreams? When did you care about anything other than winning, other than being on top, other than proving to everyone that you're the smartest and the strongest and the best?" Victoria felt anger rising in her chest, hot and defensive. "I care about building something that lasts. I care about succeeding in a world that tried to keep me down because I'm a woman, because I didn't come from money, because I didn't have the right connections. Everything I have, I earned. Every single thing. Nobody gave me anything. I fought for it, and I won, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Be stepping on other people who were also trying to earn something," Marcus said quietly, And there was something in his tone that wasn't quite judgment, but wasn't quite acceptance either. I'm not judging you, Victoria. I understand why you are the way you are. I understand the world that created you, the systems that made you think you had to be ruthless to survive. But you asked me to help fix your image, and I am, just not the way you expected. Not by pretending you're someone you're not, but by actually pushing you to become someone better. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, to tell him he was overstepping, to remind him that he worked for her, that this was her company and her life and her story. But the words died in her throat because part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, knew he was right. The interview aired on a major network on a Wednesday evening, a primetime slot that cost Victoria's company a significant amount in sponsorship money to secure. Millions of people watched as Victoria and Marcus sat together on a cream-colored sofa in a perfectly lit studio, looking like the perfect power couple. She wore a soft blue dress that her stylist said made her look approachable, and he wore a dark suit with no tie that made him look successful, but not stuffy. The interviewer, a woman with a warm smile and years of experience making people comfortable, asked gentle questions about how they met, what they loved about each other, what their hopes for the future were. Victoria delivered her rehearsed answers flawlessly, hitting every talking point her PR team had prepared. Marcus was charming and thoughtful, giving answers that made her look good with every response, telling stories about their relationship that were fictional but felt true. Then came the final question, the one that was supposed to be a softball, an easy way to end the interview on a positive note. Marcus, what would you say to people who think this relationship is just for show, just a publicity stunt to clean up Victoria's reputation? Marcus smiled, and Victoria felt her stomach drop because she recognized that smile now. It was the smile he wore when he was about to do something she hadn't planned for, hadn't anticipated, couldn't control. I'd say they should wait for Friday, Marcus said, his voice calm and confident. Friday? The interviewer asked, leaning forward with interest, sensing a story. What happens Friday? Friday, Marcus confirmed, looking directly into the camera. That's when everything becomes clear. Victoria kept smiling, but inside she was screaming. What was he talking about? What was happening Friday? They hadn't discussed Friday,